Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first episode of the On Becoming Legend podcast. I'm your host, Rory Miller, and here we talk about all things legacy. We do this primarily by looking back at the major inflection points in our lives, learning the lessons, and living them forward. Each week, I'll bring you new content that's designed to help you become more aware of the inflection points in your own life and show up every day in such a way that history can't ignore you. During each episode, you get real stories and tactical advice from myself and others in the hopes that our mistakes and lessons will help you make better decisions in your own life. This week, I'll be starting the podcast by sharing my own story, looking back at some of my own inflection points, some of the major turning points, and sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned, but also giving you some actual tactics you can apply in your own life. So not only will you be able to hear what I've learned, you'll be able to take away some action items that you can do on your own if you want to apply that lesson in your own life and start getting better results. So for me, it starts all the way back when I'm 9 years old, maybe 10. I was in fourth grade, and my mom, is a Freudian slip for you, sits me down and tells me that her and my dad are thinking about getting a divorce. Now, being that young, I remember not really understanding what divorce meant. I understood it, I think, in sort of a numb way. And when she told me, I didn't really have much of a response. And it actually took me several decades before I figured out kind of how I had internalized that and looking back at the behavior that I had when I was younger. But the main thing that I took away was that I was losing the sense of family and belonging that you get from having that tight family unit. So, if you can just sort of imagine being as a young child, you have these structures in your life, something like family or maybe church or sports or something like that is one of your constants. And one of mine was being taken away suddenly. I had lost that sense of identity that you get from having a home base or a strong foundation. And I think what that created in me was this feeling that I didn't have anywhere to belong, or that where I belonged could be taken away, that there was this sort of transient nature to it. It wasn't, I had grown up for the first 9 years of my life just sort of assuming like you have family and you have parents and they're together and that's how life is. And suddenly that changed. And I don't think at a young age I was really able to identify, obviously, what my parents were going through. So I internalized that I had lost that sense of belonging. And the way that manifested through the rest of my life is I became very compliant, both to authority and to my social groups and my peers and the people that were around me. And all of it really stemmed from the fact that I just wanted that sense of validation. I was trying to give people what I thought they wanted because I wanted them to validate and approve of me and just answer that question. And a lot of us face is, am I good enough? Am I doing it? Am I right? And I attached very strongly to the friends that were close to me. I also attached very strongly, unhealthily strong, to the romantic relationships I was in as I got older, and created a lot of toxic patterns there. And I didn't realize at the time why I was making the decisions I was making. It wasn't until I did some introspection decades later, that I looked back at some of the choices that I made, how I treated people, decisions that I made, what seemed important at the time. And at that point, I was really able to realize that I was coming from this place of not having that belonging and really wanting validation for others. So the lesson from this is to always check your motivations, and really that it's never, ever, ever something that you get past, right? Because we're all influenced by all of our experiences. And if you aren't consciously choosing the direction in your life, then you're probably just acting out sort of the programming and conditioning you've picked up from the events that have made you who you are, from your family, from your church, from your friends, from the shows you watch, whatever the influences are on your development. Those are the things that are going to dictate what direction you go. So you have to check your motivations. Ask yourself, why am I doing the thing that I'm doing? Why am I, and especially as we'll get to later in my story, some of the situations that you might be in that you don't want to be in, or situations you'd like to be in but aren't in yet, and really using those as a magnifying glass for identifying the places where what you think you want or say you want isn't actually lining up with the behaviors and the subconscious programming that you're walking out. So the tactic I want you to take away from this, just a simple thought exercise: what single event in your life is potentially still affecting you in the present, but is no longer taking place? So let me say this a little more clearly. What single event in your life has happened in the past, but is still potentially affecting how you operate in the present? And I want you to think about that. And this is one of those things that some of you might have a quick aha moment after a couple of minutes and be like, oh, wow, I hadn't given this any thought. And some of you, especially in situations where there's trauma or really deep wounds, those things can very easily get covered up as a self-protection mechanism. So it may take weeks, hours, months. It may take a long time for you to really sit back and think about this. And, a lot of people will benefit from some kind of therapy, or at least talking it out with somebody that is important to you and getting into some of these things. But, the whole goal here is that we don't just want to execute the conditioning of our past. We want to be living in a way that is the way that we design. So you want to make sure that you're being conscious of that programming in your own life, so you can either choose to go a different route or, identify that you are in fact living in accordance with your values, and that's the way you want to live. So we fast forward a couple of years. I get through high school. I graduate. I'm going to college. I went to college for 2 years, and I ended up having to drop out after 2 years due to financial reasons. So my family just couldn't afford for me to go anymore. And this was a real issue for me. So going back to me being very compliant with authority, I was just executing the plan, right? I was born in America, and the whole plan here is you go to high school, you graduate, you go to college, you graduate, you get a job, you have a family. Like that's the plan that people give to you. There's not a whole lot of discussion around doing something else. So suddenly I was faced with a fork in the road where that plan was no longer working for me, and I had to figure something else out. There weren't any manuals or books for, what if plan A doesn't work? What's plan B? I had to decide this on my own. So with a broken plan, I sort of was faced with this big now what? And fortunately, I had always had a kind of a respectful disregard for convention to some degree, and we'll come back to that, and especially as I got older. And I credit a lot of that to my father when he got divorced. It was actually years after my mom told me nonetheless, but he went through a real period of self-reflection, and one of the things that came out of that is just a real encouragement to become self-directed and to live on your own terms, and to not necessarily just do the things you're supposed to do, to really tune into who you are and what you want and all those things. So I developed that by the time I got through high school and got into college. But I think there's also a chance that I developed that self-direction because I had experienced 18 years of doing what I was told, quote unquote, of doing what everybody else wanted, my friends and my peers, and I didn't like it. It just didn't feel right. So I ended up making some pretty drastic decisions around that time. So I moved back for a few months, and then my brother and I moved 1,000 miles away to Kentucky just on a whim, more or less. My brother was living out in Arizona. He messaged me, said he was wanting to go. I said, what the heck, let's go. And I really am glad I made that decision because I was staying true to one of my values that I developed, which was I want to have a strong sense of adventure in my life. I didn't really know anything else. I just know I want this thing to be exciting. And I think part of that was just having, seen so many people, and you observe adults as you grow up, and it just so many people seemed bored and like they were settling, and I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I didn't want that. So the lesson here is to be self-directed, and this builds on what I was talking about in the last lesson of just not doing the things that you're conditioned to do or programmed to do, or that your parents say you should do, or that your church says you should do. Those things might be right, but at the end of the day, you have to ask the question of yourself, are these the things that matter most to me, and is this how I want to live my life? And if they are, then great, more power to you. But if they aren't, then you're just on a road waiting for the moment when you realize that you're on somebody else's path, and that's why you're not happy. So you want to be self-directed as often as possible. And the tactic here is really identify one thing in your life that you don't enjoy doing, and then ask yourself why you're doing it. And then one last step on top of that, do that 5 times. So if you're working a job you don't really like, well, maybe I'm a lawyer and you don't want to be a lawyer anymore. Well, why? Well, I became a lawyer because my parents were lawyers, and that's what my family does. Okay, well, why? And just keep going down that why path and give yourself real answers, and eventually you'll either find that there's really not a motivation there, it's just kind of one of those shoulds, or you'll realize that there is maybe some conditioning or programming on the part of somebody else who just, not maliciously, but push that into your life because that's what was pushed into their life. And so you really have to be the one that decides, hey, I'm going to be self-directed. I'm going to choose my own path. It doesn't mean I'm going to be disrespectful to anybody else, but it's just saying I have the ability and the freedom to live a life that I want to live, and I'm going to respect myself enough to go do it. So when I dropped out, I was at least partially self-directed because I made the decision to go start working in gyms. I just defaulted to the one thing I knew I really enjoyed, which was exercise and working out and nutrition and all that. So I went to, got a job at a gym, started selling memberships, eventually got into personal training, loved it. But I was also not being self-directed, and that my main motivation for continuing at the company that I joined was money. There was kind of this promise that if you reached a certain level, when the company sold, then there would be a payout for people that were at this level and above. And if you were at a certain level, it was going to be a pretty healthy amount of money. So I didn't know much about the world. Let's be honest. I think 20 at the time. So I knew you needed money to live, and there was this, promise of money, and obviously more money makes life a little bit easier in certain regards. So I figured, what the heck, I'll just kind of stay down this road. And it was a horrible decision. I say this, it was a horrible decision in the sense of how I had it play out in my life, but it wasn't a horrible decision because I didn't know any better at the time. But I say it was a horrible decision because if you fast forward a couple of years from that, I was 1,500 miles from my family. I didn't have any friends except for the people that I worked with. And some of them were good friends, but it still was, my entire life was the place where I worked. I worked there 10, 12 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. I was drinking probably 2 or 3 energy drinks a day just to survive and keep myself awake and get through the day. And I was putting myself to sleep with alcohol, and I was eating all the wrong foods because I just needed things that made me feel better. And junk food has a way of doing that. But I found myself a few years later realizing that I didn't have any of the things that were really important to me. And I was sitting in this hotel room that my job was paying for. I didn't even have an apartment at the time. I'm just living out of a hotel room. And I just realized, another one of those moments of clarity where I realized I don't know what I want out of life, but I know that this isn't it. So I put in my 2-week notice that night. I mean, it had just gotten that bad that I quit. I left the 3 or 4 years that I'd committed to all this and just said, I'm done. I'll figure it out later. And the lesson here is knowing when to cut your losses. Now, there's a really common fallacy that you might have heard of called the sunk cost fallacy. And the basic premise is that, well, because I've been committed to this path for so long, I need to see it all the way through. So because I've studied to be a doctor for 8 years, I need to finish the last 4, otherwise it won't be worth it. Because I've been in this marriage for 10 years, I need to stay in this relationship because I've been in here so long, even though it's abusive and unhealthy for me and my kids. You could apply this to anything. Because I started this business and I've put so much money into growing this business, I have to stay the course, otherwise it won't be worth it. And it's exactly what it's called. It's a fallacy. That is a logical misconception that people have, is that somehow how long you've been on the wrong path justifies staying on the wrong path even longer. So you need to know when you cut your losses. Now, this is a tricky question that can't be answered individually. Everybody's going to have their own answer, right? So this comes down to really knowing your values, the things that are important to you, and being confident and courageous in your decisions to go follow those things. Now, I was overweight. I had gained a bunch of weight. I was 35 pounds more than what I weigh now. I was overworked, didn't have a social life, drinking way too much. I was just unhappy. I mean, I was just dead on the inside. There was no better way to put it. And I decided I just couldn't take it anymore. And my value there was just saying I value myself more than this cause that I've been pursuing for so many years. It's just not worth it. I've allowed it to take too big of a role in my life. I need to quit. And I moved home. So I quit and I moved home, and my value there was balance. I need more time with family. I need more time not working. I need more time to focus on myself and my health. And so I made the decision based on my values to quit, and I moved home. Now, this lesson in particular is one where pride can really be your enemy, because there is a lot of humility that comes from leaving the path you've been on for a long time, especially if it's 5, 8, 10 years. If you've been in that relationship, or you've been in that school, or you've been studying this program, or you've been starting that business, there's a lot of pride that goes into having done that. And there's a lot of feelings of, well, what will people say if I quit now? How will I look? What will people think of me? What will that say about me? And those are the wrong questions to be asking, because it doesn't matter what people say about you. And if you think it does, just ride that out for the next 50 years. Just ask yourself, if you stay on this path for 50 more years so that people won't talk about you, will you be any happier? And this is a prime example of when you need to be clear on your values, because you're going to figure out the answer real quick is no, you won't be. You need to get off the path, and to hell with what people have to say about it. It's not that big of a deal. So the tactic for really applying this in your own life is take some time away, a few hours at least. But if you have, maybe you can take a long weekend or something like that. Get a piece of paper and write down the answer to, what am I doing in my life right now that I no longer want to do? And write as long as it takes for you to feel like you've got the right answer. And you'll know it. There's no, academic answer that can tell you this is exactly when you got it, but you're going to feel it. You're going to write those things out, and you're going to see them on paper, and you're going to realize that's exactly it. Those are the things in my life that are no longer bringing me joy, that are no longer aligned with who I want to be and how I want to show up, and I need to stop doing them. So I move home, I get a job, I restore that balance to my life, and a few years later, I quit my job again, except I was going a completely different direction. So I'd gotten to a leadership academy at this company I was with. One of the exercises we went through was creating a mission statement for your life. So how do you want to show up in the world? And it blew me away at the time that I was 26 years old, and this was the first time that I'd ever actively asked myself how I wanted to show up in the world. I couldn't believe that I had gone through 12 years of public school, 2 years of college, and never been taken through the exercise of how do you want to be present in the world for other people. And it blew my mind, but that was a really revolutionary concept or exercise for me, because it actually brought me in tune with what I valued most in terms of the impact that I leave on the world, or my legacy. And this was what put that into my perspective, for the first time several years ago. And I can't even explain it at this point, but I remember going through that exercise, and then through this process of introspection, I became more aware of this dream that I'd always had about joining the military. And I'd always wanted to be in special operations, Ranger, or, special forces, something like that. I just loved the idea of it. There's so many things I wanted to, I appreciated about it. And I knew I always wanted to do that. And it came back into my awareness when I was 26. And for whatever reason, I remember imagining, decades down the road, that my daughter, I didn't have a girlfriend at the time. So this is, my unborn daughter with my unknown wife at the time. I imagine my daughter coming to me facing a similar dilemma, working at a job, wanting to do this thing that she's always wanted to do, and asking me for advice. And my advice very quickly, without hesitation, was, of course, go follow your dreams. You could always get another job. There's no big deal. Like, quit your job, go do what you love to do. And if you don't like it, we can always pivot. And I realized I had to follow that same advice. Otherwise, I would be a hypocrite. So there's no chance of me giving this advice to my daughter with any sort of, credibility if I hadn't lived that way in my own life. So I knew I had to quit. So I left. I went to basic training. I went through the military. I went through 3 years of some of the toughest training they have out there. And I eventually achieved the Army Special Forces. Now, every decision is always going to have pros and cons. It wasn't like it was just all good things for me to go leave the military. There were a lot of cons to that. I had to move away from my family again. I had to spend time, extended periods of time away from my family. I ended up getting married not long before I joined the military. So we're talking, for the first 3 years that we were married, I spent 6 months of the year gone, either training or traveling or doing something, but I was not in my bed 6 months out of the year. And that's challenging, right? And then there's just the physical challenges, the mental challenges, all that stuff that comes with the military training and the way that they set it up. But the weight of the pros and the cons depends on your values. So the con of traveling and being away from my family was something I had thought about, but it was less of a negative than the positive for me of living in alignment with the things I'd always wanted to do. And you could say the same thing about any situation. The pros and cons are weighted depending on your values. Some people might be faced with a situation where one of the cons is that there's a really high financial cost. Well, if you put another person in that situation, that might mean nothing to them. Maybe they have enough money for it to be no big deal. So that's not enough of a con to outweigh it. But so it depends on your values. And you need to be having these conversations with yourself when you're faced with situations like this. But when it's all said and done, when you look back 50 years from now, 20 years from now, 5 years from now, next year, you're going to want to be able to say that you were true to yourself. You're not going to live a full life by living in alignment with what other people want you to do or what you think you should do, quote unquote. What people think is not on anyone's list of values that I've ever met. And if it is, I can guarantee you're living an unsatisfied life. So the tactic for applying this lesson, the lesson here is to pay attention to the call. These motivations to go do something radical are things that we all face. All of us have had that desire at some point to just pivot and just go a different direction. And most of us stay in our lane because we're scared of what might happen. We let the cons overwhelm whatever possible pros we think are there. But the lesson is pay attention to the call because it's there. Decide based on your values, and then the tactic to apply this in your own life. So get some time away, same thing, a few hours, and write down the answer to what am I avoiding doing that I know would light me up? What am I avoiding doing that I know would light me up? Write out the answer to that. It's going to be the same thing as the last question. What am I doing that I don't want to do? You're going to notice as soon as you write it down, there's going to be, you can't argue with truth, especially when we're talking about truth for you specifically. You're going to write it down and you're going to know it. And hopefully you make the right decisions based on that information and can get aligned with your values and make a different decision tomorrow. So I'm in the military. I achieved my dream. I'm special forces. And I don't remember the exact timeline. Maybe a year later, I found out that I was diagnosed with a heart condition called atrial fibrillation. Now, it's not a life-threatening heart condition. It's just an electrical malfunction in your heart where the part of your heart that's supposed to control the rhythm doesn't. A different part takes over and it gets kind of funky with the rhythm. So obviously, again, not life-threatening if I'm a civilian, but as somebody in the military who the livelihood of other people may very well be depending on me being physically able to move them or carry them or guide them or instruct them is kind of a big deal if for whatever reason I go into a heart arrhythmia and I'm not physically able to perform my job. So not a big deal for me now, but it wasn't something that I was going to be able to stay in special forces with. So I had two choices. I could stay the course that I had been on for 3 years. I could have a heart surgery. The success rate was pretty high, especially for healthy people. The recovery was pretty good, and I'd be able to stay my job. Or I could pivot and change directions again. Now, keep in mind, I had just given 3 years of my life to the hardest training I've ever been through. And a year later, I'm told that I can either have heart surgery or get out of the military. And that was a really difficult decision to make. The lesson for me, and the lesson I want you to take away from this, is you don't control your conditions. So I had developed a habit of taking control of my decisions and my choices, but you don't control the things that happen around you. You can control what route you take to work. You cannot control if there's traffic. You can control the food you eat. You cannot control what happens with it in your body after you eat it. There are certain things about your circumstances, your conditions that are outside of your control. And you need to recognize when something that you're trying to affect change in falls into one of those categories. Because if you're trying to change something you can't change, you're just going to end up frustrated. So I brought it back to my values. As I, again, developed this as a habit and a behavior over so many years of practicing this. My values was what determined how I decided. And I decided that I valued the additional time that I would be with my family. I valued the freedom to pursue other opportunities and to become the best person I dream of being, the best version of myself. And I valued not having heart surgery at 30 years old. Those were the things that made my decision for me. I did not want to leave the military. I would have loved to stay in my role. I love the team that I was on. I love the guys that I work with. I love the job I got to do every single day. But I valued the opportunity to go do these other things more. And it hurt because I had come so far. Remember, I could have fallen into the sunk cost theory of, well, I'm 3 years in. I might as well stay the course. But it just didn't align with my values. Now, it wasn't the end that I imagined for my time in the military. But again, you don't control your conditions. So I had to just accept that it was what it was. I made a decision based on my values, and I had to continue mission doing something else. So the tactic for this, you're going to already have your journal out, hopefully from the last couple you've done. Write down the answer to the question, where am I resisting something that I can't change? Where am I resisting something that I can't change? And this is going to bring into your awareness the elements of your life where you are either physically or emotionally or financially putting off or resisting or trying to fight something that is out of your control. And I'm here to tell you it's a losing battle. You cannot alter your conditions directly. There are just things that happen. It's just part of the world we live in. So where am I resisting something that I can't change? So now, fortunately, part of the process of me getting out of the military is that you have a little bit of heads up. It's not immediate. So I knew that I was going to be transitioning out of the military and I needed an income to replace my Army income. And I did not... One thing the Army is, or I'd say the military in general, maybe everybody doesn't have this opinion. One thing the Army is good for is discouraging you from ever wanting to have a boss again. And that was 100% true in my situation. I had already become familiar with internet marketing and different ways of starting businesses from home. It was something my wife and I started pursuing when we had our first baby because we needed to make the extra income. She was going to stay home. So I was already familiar with some of the options. So I knew I now was the do or die. I had to start a business because this business was going to support my family whenever the Army income went away. So I started a business. Again, we had been kind of working on businesses. I'd been doing some marketing and things like that for just different projects that my wife and I had. And I came across some training and somebody that would be able to mentor me into building a business based off those skills. So handling marketing and paid advertising for other people. And I got my first client the week, 2 days after my son was born. My wife's labor with my son was 51 hours in total, I think. And, at least 35 hours of those were pretty intense. And we had our baby. And then 2 days later, I had I think I got the email back that somebody was going to hire me. Maybe I talked to him the week before. I can't remember. And so now I'm faced with a different dilemma, right? I'm still in the military. I still have my full-time job. Now I have a second kid. So I'm presented with this new situation where I have to learn how to manage 2 babies, 2 jobs, still be taking care of my fitness and my intellectual health and my emotional health and doing all those things to demonstrate self-respect. And I have this challenge that I'm faced with. But this is one of the things that I've learned in the military that's become really valuable for me. There was no other way but through it. There was no option for me to back off or to do less or to not have one of those things. I can't give the kid back. I can't not build a business unless I want to be broke or have to go get a 9-to-5 job when I get out of the military. So there was no other way than for me to figure it out. And that is what aligned with my goals and my values. So the lesson here is you do what you have to do, not what's easy. I should say this another way, not what's comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of progress. So many people spend their entire lives finding and trying to find ways to make themselves more comfortable. And comfort is the enemy of growth. You do what you have to do, not what's easy or not what's comfortable. So the tactic for applying this is commit to making the right decision, not the easy one. This, in the military, that's saying of doing the hard right, not the easy wrong. And I'm so grateful for that lesson because that's something that's continued to apply in my business and my relationships anywhere else. And I think so many people would get value from that if they could do it. Every single day you have to commit to making the right decision, not the easy one. Now, you might ask, well, what is the right decision? You don't know until you know what your values are. So I'm going to keep coming back to this. You have to know what you value in order to know right from wrong. And sometimes that's morally right from wrong. Sometimes it's financially. Sometimes it's spiritually. Sometimes it's emotionally. But you can't make those decisions unless you've decided for yourself what your values are. You can make a decision based on the right values. And here's the trick with this. Once you make the commitment to make the right decision, not the easy one, you have to recommit every single day. We live in a fast-paced world that is full of distractions and people trying to take you off your path. The second you start to live a value-based life and start to walk your own path and be self-directed, you're going to find people that want to pull you off that path because you standing up and living in a different way is a magnifying glass to them of what's possible for them. And some people don't want to hear that. They want to stay where they are. They want to stay comfortable. We just talked about this. So commit to making the right decision, not the easy one. And you have to recommit every day. And this is one of the reasons I keep talking about self-care because that's the kind of thing that gives you the energy to make those commitments every single day. So I'm out of the military. I have this business. And again, I'm faced with a turning point because I'm now coming to the point where I'm able to make a reality out of something that's been a dream of mine, another sort of latent dream since I was 18 or 20. And that's my dream of coaching people. I've dreamed of this since I think in high school. I was always dreaming about coaching people, speaking, giving seminars, teaching from stages, things like that. I just absolutely loved it. And my purpose, it left clues. Even before I could identify what my purpose is, my purpose left clues. I've always gravitated towards positions that allowed me to teach or guide or mentor. As a personal trainer, I was always educating people on nutrition and exercise and how to take care of themselves. I eventually got into a position where I was training trainers, so I got to teach them how to become personal trainers and help them get certified, educate them. You may not know this about Special Forces, but one of our primary roles when we go into countries is educating and training. We teach people tactics and we educate them on how to protect themselves and how to use their weapons and all different kinds of things that just to help them to be equipped to do what they need to do in their own country. And I'd always gravitated towards those positions, so I knew that there was something inside of me that just really lit up when I got the chance to teach people. My purpose also uses my strengths. So one of my strengths is communication and the ability to take concepts that are otherwise, just kind of obscure or maybe vague or even just complicated and break them down in a way that people understand. I got my first sign of this when I was in college. I was helping tutor some people in chemistry. And I was, each person understood it differently. And I had to find these unique ways to communicate these concepts to people in a way that would help them grasp it and do better. But, by the end of the semester, I had classes. I had, groups of, 15, 20 people that were all coming together to study chemistry with me. And I just remember feeling so alive when I got to do that. And then one of my other strengths is a respectful disregard for convention. So, at this point in my life, having lived several different lives, I don't see anybody's right to tell me how things should be done. I get that there are some things that are tradition. Some things are just the way things have always been done. I got it. But I don't respect anybody's right to tell me how I have to live my life. And I choose to live my life based on my values and the direction that I want to take my life in. So in a nutshell, my purpose is to inspire others with the desire to fulfill their potential and the confidence in their ability to achieve it. I wasn't able to put words to this until I was 26, but this purpose has been with me my entire life and has stayed with me since. And the lesson here is that your purpose has always been inside of you. It's not something that comes from outside of you. Nobody can come to you and tell you what your purpose is. Your purpose is inside of you. It's always been there. The question is, will you take the time and do the work necessary to find it within yourself and then make the hard decision of living that way every single day? And here's a tactic that's been super powerful for me. I know it's been powerful for others. And if you really put the time into this, this could be absolutely game-changing for you. I want you to take the piece of paper you've already used for the last few tactics, and I want you to write your own eulogy. I know that might sound a little bit morbid. I don't usually encourage people to think about their own death, but what I want you to think about, imagine writing your own eulogy from the perspective of your spouse or your coworker or your best friend or somebody at your church or your faith organization that you go to or your community. Imagine the people that matter most to you. And now imagine them at your funeral giving a eulogy, and I want you to write out what you would want them to say about you. How did you show up in the world? How did you make their lives better? What was it about you that they looked up to? How did they admire you? Why did they respect you? What was important to you? What kind of decision maker were you? Just all of these things that can come from this. I want you to write your eulogy, and you can write one from each of their perspectives. And you're going to end up with a laundry list of your values in a nutshell. And then the challenge is, how do you take that list and just live that way every single day? But that is going to tell you exactly what is most important to you and how you need to show up with the people that matter most to you. If you do that exercise, I promise you, it could be life-changing for you. It's been life-changing for me, and I've talked to other people. It's been life-changing for them as well. So really take the time and do that. So that is my story in a nutshell. There's a little bit more to it. I'll post a link to my website in the show notes where you can go to the actual about page on my website if you want to read a little bit more context and just in more detail, get to know me. But I hope you'll take these lessons and these tactics and apply them in your own life. If you do, I really hope you'll share with me the results. So you can find me on social media. I'll post the links in the show notes as well. I would love to hear from you about how these things have impacted your life. And we'll be back next week with another episode to help you live in a way so that history cannot ignore you.